I'm a 57-year-old man, and I've been married to the love of my life, let's call her Sarah, for 26 years. We met back in college, and we were friends for nearly 10 years before tying the knot. During those 10 years, we spent 2 as friends, one with me trying to win her over, and the remaining 7 dating. There were even a couple of years where we lived in different cities due to work, but our relationship stood the test of time and distance. Sarah wasn't just my wife and the mother of our children. She was also my closest friend, the person who knew me better than anyone else. That's why her betrayal devastated me. About a week ago, Sarah and I attended our university's 35th year class reunion. The college organizes a reunion every year for those who graduated 35 years prior, and it's always a pretty big deal. This year was our class's turn. Sarah and I were both looking forward to reconnecting with old friends and seeing how everyone had changed over the years. We were also excited to show that we were one of the few couples from our college days who had gotten married and stayed together for so long. When we walked into the event, everything seemed perfect. We were having a great time catching up with friends we hadn't seen in decades, sharing memories, and enjoying the evening. Then, someone from our past approached us. Let's call him Mark. Back in college, Mark had been obsessed with Sarah. Everyone knew about his feelings for her. Sarah was one of the smartest and most attractive women in our class, and naturally, she had a lot of admirers, me included. But unlike the rest of US, Mark never really moved on when it became clear that Sarah wasn't interested in him. Mark wasn't the type to take a hint. Even after Sarah and I had started dating, he kept pursuing her, trying to win her over. I never let it get to me, though, since Sarah was clearly out of his league and she was already with me. Mark knew this too, but he never gave up. In fact, when Sarah and I got married, Mark actually sent me a message saying that Sarah had made a mistake and that he could have been the one to make her happiest. Sarah and I laughed it off back then and never gave it another thought. Until now. When Mark approached us at the reunion, I thought he'd have moved on by now. After all, it had been 35 years since college, and Sarah and I had been married for 26 of those years. But to my surprise, he still seemed fixated on her. He greeted us with a hug, though Sarah kept her distance and only offered him a handshake. There was an uncomfortable tension as Mark sat down across from Sarah, giving her a look that felt all too familiar from our college days. Trying to ease the awkwardness, I asked if he had brought anyone with him to the event. Mark replied, a little too smugly, that he was still single. He mentioned that he had been married briefly in his 40s, but had divorced shortly after. I offered a polite, sorry to hear that, but Mark responded with, well, you should be sorry. You stole the love of my life, followed by a laugh that came off more as bitter than funny. Now, if this had happened when I was younger, maybe I'd have gotten angry, but we were both pushing 60, and I didn't see the point in making a scene. Besides, Mark wasn't exactly someone who could intimidate anyone. He was the type of guy who never quite fit in. The room went silent for a moment, and it was clear that others had heard what he said. People exchanged awkward glances, but we all tried to ignore it and move on with the evening. Sarah, however, was clearly affected. Our close friend from college, Emily, noticed too. She pulled Sarah aside, and the two of us tried to distract her, telling her not to let Mark ruin the night. Sarah tends to dwell on things, so Emily and I made a point to keep her spirits up. But, unfortunately, Mark seemed determined to keep inserting himself into the evening. He came over again not long after, this time apologizing. He said he hadn't meant to upset Sarah and that he only wanted her to know that, even after all these years, someone still admired her. I couldn't stand his phony charm any longer, so I told him to back off. Sarah, trying to be the bigger person, asked him to leave us alone, but Mark kept pushing, asking her to forgive him so we could all enjoy the night. Realizing it was probably best to avoid a bigger confrontation, Sarah gave him a quick hug, telling him it was time to let the past go. After that, we all headed to the dance floor, trying to move on from the whole incident. The night seemed to pick back up after that, with friends joining in and everyone starting to relax. At one point, I noticed Emily and Sarah talking to Mark again. He was cracking jokes and dancing awkwardly, trying to be the life of the party. I figured everything was fine now. Sarah even smiled at something Mark whispered in her ear, so I assumed whatever tension had been there was gone. With that in mind, I felt comfortable stepping away and enjoying the rest of the evening, catching up with old friends. But then, About an hour later, I realized that Sarah and Emily were nowhere to be found. At first, I didn't think too much of it. Everyone was mingling and chatting in different groups, but as the night wore on, their absence became more noticeable. I had been catching up with other friends on my own, but when Sarah and Emily didn't return after a while, I started to get worried. I tried calling them, but neither picked up. The loud music was probably drowning out their phones, so I decided to go look for them. After about 30 minutes, Sarah finally came back, but something seemed off. There was nothing noticeably different about her appearance, but I could feel that something had changed. She was unusually quiet and kept urging me to leave. Emily joined us not long after, but the strange part was that Sarah and Emily didn't exchange a single word the rest of the night. I thought maybe they had argued because they were avoiding eye contact. I kept asking Sarah what was wrong, why she wanted to leave so early, but she just stayed silent. I had hoped to stay until the end of the reunion, but Sarah insisted we head out, so eventually, I agreed. During the drive back, which took over an hour, Sarah barely said a word. I kept asking her if everything was okay, but she just mumbled that she was tired and needed some rest. It wasn't like her at all. Sarah was usually full of energy, always the life of the party. Seeing her like this, withdrawn and quiet, left me feeling uneasy. I asked if her mood had something to do with Emily, but she simply said no and gave no further explanation. I assumed she was exhausted and left it at that. When we got home, while most of our friends were still posting pictures of the reunion and chatting on social media about how great the night was, Sarah quietly slipped into bed, pretending to fall asleep almost immediately. I knew it wasn't genuine. She was faking it. I stayed up for a bit longer, scrolling through my phone, feeling too restless to sleep. At around 2 a.m., I finally lay down, exhausted from the night. I must have fallen asleep quickly because I don't remember anything until Sarah woke me up later. She was crying, her head resting on my chest. I held her, thinking she was just feeling emotional about seeing old friends again. But she didn't respond to any of my attempts to comfort her. She just kept crying. I let her cry it out, trying to be supportive even though I didn't know what was going on. After what felt like an eternity, her sobs started to quiet down, and that's when she dropped the bomb. She confessed that she had cheated on me, with Mark. I didn't know how to react. I was in complete shock, unable to process what she was telling me. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen Sarah that night, dancing with Mark and Emily, laughing with everyone else, before the three of them had disappeared for about an hour. When Sarah came back, she looked different, distant, and insisted we leave. Sarah explained that Emily had known what happened, which explained the tension between them. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, so Sarah continued talking, filling in the details herself. She told me that while they were dancing, Mark had kept apologizing for embarrassing her earlier in the evening. He was flattering her, telling her that even after all these years, she was the most amazing woman he had ever known. Apparently, his words had an effect on her. She said she started to believe him, that he seemed genuinely sincere. He asked her to take a walk with him outside. At first, she said no, but he kept pressing, saying it would be their last chance to talk, and he wanted her to understand his true feelings. Eventually, she gave in and agreed to go for a walk on the university lawn to get away from the noise and find some quiet. Sarah told me that during the walk, Mark poured his heart out, telling her he had never stopped loving her and that she was the most incredible person he had ever met. She admitted that she was drunk and feeling vulnerable, and that's when things went too far. Mark took her hand, and in that moment, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if some weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't go into explicit details, but she told me enough. She said her guilty conscience kicked in during the middle of it, and she pushed him away, ending it before things went even further. But the damage was done. I lay there in bed, feeling numb. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything she had just told me. She kept apologizing, crying, and begging for my forgiveness. I didn't say a word. I asked her to give me some space, to let me think. She clung to me, terrified of what might happen next, but I stayed silent. As I lay there, something clicked in my mind. I remembered that when Sarah came back from her time with Mark, he had given me this strange, smug grin. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it made sense. It was the look of someone who felt like they had finally won. That realization filled me with a surge of anger and disgust. Lying next to her in bed suddenly became unbearable. The weight of what she had done, combined with the memory of that smug look on Mark's face, made it impossible to find any peace. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew things had changed forever. After hours of Sarah crying herself to sleep, I noticed she had finally drifted into a deep slumber. Quietly, I slipped out of bed, packed my laptop, wallet, and other essentials into a backpack, and left the house. I loved her. After 26 years of marriage, I couldn't imagine a life without her. We had built a family together, raised 2 amazing kids, but I knew I couldn't stay. Sarah was persuasive, and if I'd stayed until morning, I knew she would convince me to reconsider. So, instead, I checked into a hotel, blocked her number, and cut off all her social media accounts. By the time I finally managed to fall asleep, it was nearly sunrise. Around 8 or 9 a.m., my phone started ringing non-stop, calls from our kids. Sarah and I have 2 children, a 24-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter. Both are in college and share an apartment off campus. I realized then that I had made a hasty decision by ghosting Sarah that night. I should have planned things better, taken more time to think through my next steps and how I would handle everything. I've read stories of people who stayed with their cheating spouses, pretending everything was normal while secretly planning their revenge. They would expose the affair at just the right moment. But in my case, I couldn't do that. Sarah wasn't just my wife. She had been my best friend for decades. I could never keep up a facade around her. She'd see right through it. And pretending everything was fine? That felt impossible after what she'd done. I had never even considered the possibility of Sarah cheating on me, so I had no plan for how to handle it when the unthinkable happened. When my kids started calling me, I didn't have a prepared strategy, but I knew I had to respond before they got worried enough to involve the police. I called my son first. He's more level-headed and calm than my daughter, and I figured he'd be better equipped to handle the news. I told him the truth, that there was no easy way to break it to him, but his mom had cheated on me the night before with a man from her past. I didn't sugarcoat it. He was shocked, as anyone would be. We'd always been the picture of a happy, stable family. To my son, his mom was the embodiment of everything good about our family. It shattered him to hear that she'd done something so devastating. He kept asking if there was some kind of misunderstanding, that maybe it wasn't what I thought. He wanted to know every detail, everything in order, but I didn't want to drag him through all that. He's still young and has his own life ahead of him. The last thing I wanted to do was crush his spirit. I told him I wished it were a bad joke, but it wasn't. His mother had confessed everything to me. He's 24, and while he's dealt with heartbreak before, this was on a whole different level. I asked him to keep it quiet for the time being, to promise not to tell anyone else until I figured out how to handle it. As for my daughter, I sent her a simple text. I told her that I was stressed from work and would be out of town for a few days. I didn't want to pull her into this yet. She still believed I was on a business trip, while my son and Sarah knew the truth, that I had left her. For the next few days, I holed up in the hotel, trying to figure out my next move. I spent hours online looking up the best divorce lawyers and reading through stories of other men who had faced similar situations. Many of them had taken drastic steps, revenge plots against their cheating wives and the affair partners. I understood the anger, the need for revenge, but that wasn't what I wanted. No matter how much Sarah had hurt me, I still loved her. The idea of destroying her life was something I couldn't even fathom. But going back to her wasn't an option either. Reconciliation wasn't something I could see myself doing. I wasn't sure how I would ever move past this or how I'd even begin to recover. Between my work, our children, and everything we had built together over the years, there was so much to think about. I made an appointment with a lawyer for the following day, hoping they could help me make sense of the legal side of things. I wanted to handle this as carefully as possible, but I was still so lost. All the while, I was reading through comments from others who had gone through similar situations. I felt a sense of community, like I wasn't the only one grappling with this kind of betrayal. One thing I realized as I read through the responses was that I hadn't shared some important details earlier. Both Sarah and I were management consultants for years, but in our late 40s, we left our full-time jobs. Sarah had always had a passion for writing, and she pursued that dream, while I became a freelance business consultant. Since I didn't have a fixed office or traditional work schedule, I wasn't worried about Sarah showing up at my workplace or trying to track me down there. But even with that peace of mind, there was still so much uncertainty ahead. I wasn't sure how to navigate the coming days, weeks, or even months. All I knew was that the life I had known for the past 26 years had changed forever, and there was no going back. I often work from home or at my clients' offices, consulting for several businesses at once. So far, Sarah hasn't managed to track me down. As I mentioned before, we're nearing 60, and for years, we've been planning our retirement. We've been saving up to buy a small beach house in a quiet part of the countryside. The plan was to make the purchase next year, and we'd already started looking at properties, even talking to some owners. Luckily, we hadn't made any commitments yet. If we had, it would have added another layer of complications. Since I left, Sarah has been trying relentlessly to contact me. After I met with the lawyer, he advised that I should be honest with our kids about the separation, especially since they're adults. We also went over how to divide our assets, and I decided to split everything evenly between Sarah and me. Retaliation wasn't something I was interested in. Sarah deserves her share of what we built together. She's earned it, even if she's also earned the separation. I know Sarah well. There's a good chance she'd offer to give up her claim to the money in an attempt to reconcile and keep the family together. But the divorce papers were being prepared, and I needed to move forward. I arranged to meet with my kids, asking my son to bring his sister to a local restaurant without telling her that I'd be there. He agreed. The moment my daughter saw me, she came at me with a barrage of questions. One of her first concerns was whether I was cheating on their mom, since she knew I'd cut off all contact with Sarah. She was upset, and seeing her like that was hard, but I had to stay composed for both of them. I reassured her that there was no one else in the picture and gradually revealed the truth. My son already knew, but he hadn't been told what my next steps were. When I told my daughter that her mother had cheated on me, she was devastated. For the last 15 days, she had been living with Sarah in the house, clueless about what had really happened. She hugged me and apologized for being angry earlier. They both asked if there was any chance I'd reconsider and give my marriage another shot. I made it clear that I was moving forward with the divorce. Watching them break down was heartbreaking, but they understood my pain. They promised to support me through this, no matter what. During our conversation, my daughter mentioned that Sarah hadn't been eating or sleeping properly since I left. She's been crying and pacing, trying to reach me in every way possible. She even went to several of my clients' offices, asking if they'd seen me, but they all told her I hadn't been there in weeks. My daughter had asked Sarah if something had happened between us, but Sarah didn't give her any answers. Instead, she locked herself in her room, sobbing. I asked my daughter to stay with Sarah for now, at least until the divorce is finalized. I could see their sadness slowly shifting into anger as we talked about their mom. I understand that they've been hurt, too. Our family is broken, and there's only one person responsible for that. But I don't want them to hate their mother. I've insisted that they continue to offer her their support. Then something happened that I never expected. A few days later, I received a text from Mark asking about Sarah. He suggested that if I was planning on divorcing her because of her infidelity, he would be willing to take her off my hands. I replied that Sarah was free to make her own choices and blocked him after that. I knew he was trying to provoke me, but honestly, I felt nothing toward him. I wasn't angry at Mark. I didn't marry him or trust him. All my pain and betrayal were tied to Sarah. If she wanted to be with him, that was her choice. It didn't matter to me anymore. The divorce papers were sent out, and I waited for news from my daughter about how Sarah would react. In the meantime, I had plenty of other matters to handle: my assets, retirement, and most importantly, the well-being of my children. It's been a while since my last update, and I apologize for the delay. I had a lot to take care of, but now I can say that the divorce is settled. When Sarah received the papers, she didn't take it well at all. She completely unraveled. Up until then, she had been living in a fantasy, thinking I was just angry and that I'd come back once I cooled down. But when she got the divorce papers, that illusion was shattered. She immediately asked my lawyer to set up a meeting with me, but he refused. He told her she was getting half of our assets, which, in his opinion, was more than she deserved. Sarah responded by saying she didn't want any of the money. She only wanted me back. I told you before, I know her well. She asked to see me one last time before signing the papers, but I wasn't sure if I could face her again. Sarah was confident in her ability to persuade me if she could just get me on a FaceTime call. She knew that if we talked, she might convince me to change my mind about the separation. And the truth is, she wasn't wrong. If we had met, I might have reconsidered everything. I still loved her deeply, and seeing her deteriorating like this was unbearable for me. But no matter how much I loved her, I couldn't ignore my own self-respect. She had taken me for granted, torn apart our family for something I still couldn't fully understand. I refused to delve into that dark place again. I just knew I couldn't live like this anymore. My daughter called, saying she needed to meet me urgently. She told me that Sarah's condition had worsened so severely that she had been hospitalized. Sarah had fallen into a deep depression and was refusing to take any medication or treatment to help her. She had stopped eating altogether and was now on a liquid diet at the hospital. I know many people might see me as cold and heartless right now, questioning whether I ever truly loved Sarah because of my apparent indifference to her condition. To that, I have only one question. Have you ever experienced betrayal? If not, then you can't fully grasp the kind of pain I've been living with. Saying I loved Sarah doesn't even begin to cover it. I idolized her. She was my partner, my best friend, and the mother of my children. Mark was right about one thing. Finding someone like Sarah is nearly impossible. She's intelligent, talented, compassionate, everything you could hope for in a life partner. I made sure to treat her accordingly, always supporting her in every way I could. And yet, she repaid me by stabbing me in the heart when I least expected it. I never imagined, not in my worst nightmares, that she would betray me, especially with Mark. A few days after Sarah received the divorce papers, Emily reached out. She wanted to know how I was doing and asked about Sarah as well. I told her that we were in the process of separating, and she didn't seem surprised. She admitted that she already knew why. Later, during another conversation, Emily asked how I had found out about the affair. I told her that Sarah had confessed everything to me. Emily expressed her regrets and revealed that she had actually warned Sarah about Mark. She had told her not to leave with him, but Sarah had ignored her. Then, Emily shared something that shook me to my core. Her version of events differed slightly from what Sarah had told me. According to Emily, she and Sarah were happily dancing when Mark joined them and started getting close to Sarah. He whispered something in Sarah's ear, which she claimed was an apology for his earlier behavior. But Emily noticed that Sarah didn't seem uncomfortable. In fact, she appeared to enjoy Mark's attention. When Mark suggested they go for a walk, Sarah looked at Emily, almost as if seeking her approval. Emily strongly advised against it. Everyone knew how creepy Mark could be. Despite her warning, Sarah excused herself and went for a walk with Mark. At first, Emily wasn't too concerned because Sarah had seemed interested in going. But after some time passed and Sarah hadn't returned, Emily got worried. She went looking for them, and when she finally found them, it wasn't on the lawn, as Sarah had claimed. They were in the changing rooms of the college's swimming pool. I was stunned. Sarah had told me they'd walked around outside, but now I was hearing that Emily had caught them in the act, only stopping because Sarah spotted Emily approaching. So it wasn't guilt that ended it, as Sarah had led me to believe. It was Emily's interruption that put a stop to things. Up until that moment, I had held on to some respect for Sarah for at least owning up to her mistakes. Despite her betrayal, I believed her when she said she had gotten carried away and stopped because of her conscience. But now I realized that wasn't the case. Sarah hadn't stopped because of guilt or remorse. She'd been caught. The college pool was a good 15-minute walk from the party, and the changing rooms were deep inside the building. You don't just end up there by accident. It was a deliberate choice on Sarah's part. After sharing her side of the story, Emily asked if I could see myself giving Sarah another chance, given that Sarah had been honest with me and confessed right away. Emily didn't know, of course, that Sarah's confession had been different from what really happened. I didn't explain or answer her question, but in that moment, all the respect I had left for Sarah disappeared. Meanwhile, my children kept me updated on Sarah's worsening condition. They told me she was on the verge of harming herself. Hearing that shook me, but it didn't change what I knew in my heart. I couldn't go back to her after this. I decided to call Emily and explain what Sarah had told me. I wanted her to know that the story I got from Sarah was very different from what she had seen with her own eyes. I had hoped to find some clarity, but all it did was solidify my decision. Sarah had lied to me, and despite everything, I couldn't forgive that. Even in her miserable state, she had chosen to cover up the truth, and that's when I realized I had truly lost all respect for her. I asked Emily to visit Sarah and have an open conversation with her. Sarah had been keeping the truth locked inside, which was only causing her more suffering. I also instructed Emily to let Sarah know that I was aware of the full truth about that night and that I had no intention of forgiving her or taking her back. It was in Sarah's best interest to focus on her health because I knew she was deliberately harming herself in the hope of reconciliation. After all, I know her better than anyone, don't I? Emily visited Sarah and later updated me on how she was doing. Although Sarah hasn't fully recovered from her depression and weakness, my daughter mentioned that she is doing considerably better. On top of that, Sarah finally signed the divorce papers, which brought me a huge sense of relief. Now that the divorce is moving forward, I've decided to wrap up my work and set off on a solo journey. I've abandoned the idea of settling down in one place. It would drive me crazy to stay put. I know I haven't handled the situation as gracefully as some people in similar circumstances, but I've done the best I can. Let's see what the future holds. I'll keep you all updated. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. It's been a year since my last update, and I wish I could say time has flown by, but for me, it hasn't felt that way. After the separation, I spent a few months in a motel and later rented a condo until the divorce was finalized. Work-wise, as planned, I transitioned to clients with whom I could work remotely 100%. As for the money Sarah and I had saved for our retirement home, I gave her 50% and I split the remaining 50%, my share, between my 2 adult children. I don't need it, and they're responsible enough to make good use of the money. Sarah is still undergoing therapy, and Emily stays in regular contact with her, sometimes checking in on me too. Emily recently shared something surprising about Sarah, and honestly, I never expected it. Take this with a grain of salt since it comes from Emily, who's still supportive of Sarah, but I trust she has no reason to deceive me. Here's the bombshell. Despite all my claims that I know Sarah better than anyone, this news made me question if I ever really knew her at all. I've always considered Sarah a strong, independent woman, but it seems that loneliness took a much heavier toll on her than I realized. Apparently, after we separated, Sarah began chatting with Mark. At first, he reciprocated her interest, expressing his so-called love for her, but as soon as he learned about our divorce, his behavior changed. He started ghosting her. Sarah was devastated to discover that Mark had cut off communication after she told him about the divorce. She reminded him of all the things he had said about loving her and wanting to be with her despite everything, but it turns out he had been playing her from the start. Mark had only been flirting with Sarah for a casual, physical relationship, nothing more. He made it clear that he had no intention of committing to a marriage or a deeper emotional connection with her. He said Sarah was too strong-willed for him. For anyone who knows Sarah, it's almost unbelievable to think that she stooped so low, practically begging Mark for a relationship. Everyone knew what kind of man Mark was, unsavory, to say the least. Eventually, Mark revealed his true intentions, admitting that he only wanted physical intimacy, while Sarah had been seeking emotional support and love. He even mentioned that he already had a live-in partner and was happy with that arrangement. All of his admiration and declarations of love? Completely fake. To make matters worse, when they had a disagreement, Mark taunted her, telling her that he had deceived her, even going as far as saying that he thought she was smart, but in the end, he had outwitted her. He claimed he had tricked her, and it broke Sarah. Hearing this, she sank even deeper into depression, realizing she had lost everything by falling for his lies. The last update I got about Sarah was a couple of weeks ago. My daughter had been living with her since I moved out, trying to help her cope. But after a year, my daughter came to the conclusion that she could no longer stay with her mom. Sarah had become someone entirely different from the strong, resilient woman she used to be. Sarah, once so emotionally grounded, had transformed into an insecure, erratic individual who constantly craved the attention of others. She had become controlling and possessive, bombarding my children with calls and texts if they didn't respond immediately. At one point, she even tried to convince my son to move back in with her until he got married, but he refused. She was pressuring my daughter to stay home more often, to avoid spending time with friends or going on trips. My children are adults now, and they can't be controlled like that. Whenever my daughter tried to talk to Sarah about her intrusive behavior, Sarah would break down, saying she was terrified of losing them, especially after losing me. My children, trying their best to support her, reassured Sarah that they had no intention of abandoning her. But they also made it clear that if she continued to act this way, they might have to reconsider how much time they could spend with her. This, of course, led to more heated arguments. Sarah began blaming our children for not supporting her during her hardest times. This behavior was unfamiliar to me, and my children were equally confused by it. Eventually, they had to confront her, explaining that it was her own actions that tore apart our once happy and loving family. What had once been a harmonious, stable home was now fractured and unrecognizable. Sarah struggled to accept that her children held her responsible for the fallout. 2 weeks ago, my daughter moved out of the house. She had tried her best to help Sarah, but she couldn't put her life on hold indefinitely. I fully supported her decision. It was time for her to move forward, and Sarah needed to regain control of her life. Some might find satisfaction in seeing their cheating ex in such misery, especially in their 20s or 30s, but I couldn't take any happiness from it. In fact, I felt sorry for Sarah. Her poor choices had condemned her to a lifetime of regret and suffering. I sincerely hope she can rediscover who she used to be, a confident, strong woman who doesn't need validation from people like Mark for emotional support. As for me, the past year has been a journey. I've lived in 4 different countries, immersing myself in local cultures, savoring new cuisines, and experiencing entirely different ways of life. It's been incredible. Initially, I was disappointed that my original retirement plans had been derailed. I had always envisioned spending my golden years in peace with Sarah, but now I find satisfaction in exploring the world and embracing different cultures. I've had the privilege of meeting amazing people in all corners of the globe. To be clear, I haven't entered into any new relationships, nor am I actively seeking one. I'm open to whatever the future holds, but for now, I'm content with where I am. I'll update you all if anything significant happens. Hello, everyone. I apologize for not providing updates over the past couple of years. The truth is, not much has changed, except for my extensive travels. I've visited more than a dozen countries, and I've even reignited my passion for painting. Initially, I started this thread to share my story about my cheating wife, so I didn't think it was necessary to update you all on my travel experiences. However, something significant happened recently that prompted me to share. Last month, after 4 years, I saw Sarah again. It was because of my son's upcoming wedding. He's found the love of his life and decided to tie the knot. 2 months before the wedding, he called and asked if Sarah and I could meet his fiancée's parents. At first, I was hesitant and suggested I could meet them directly at the wedding. But then I realized it wasn't about me. It was about being there for my son and fulfilling my responsibilities as his father. The bride's parents graciously hosted a dinner a week before the wedding. Although I hadn't confirmed my attendance, I decided at the last minute to go. It was challenging to see Sarah in this setting. I would have preferred for only one of us to attend, but I knew I needed to be there for my son. When I arrived, Sarah seemed surprised. She looked different, and I could see that she had changed over the years. She greeted me with a polite smile, but I could sense the tension. Throughout the years, Sarah had always kept her thick, long hair, but now, she seemed to have aged more than I expected. Interestingly, we were seated next to each other at the table, making me wonder if our son hadn't informed the hosts that this would be our first encounter in years. Still, there was no issue in front of others. Sarah remained silent, but when we had a moment alone, she commented that I looked healthier and happier. I simply responded that cutting out all the toxicity from my life had made a big difference. That seemed to catch her off guard. She glanced around to make sure no one had overheard us, then asked if I was in a relationship. I dodged the question, telling her that my relationship status wasn't her concern anymore. During the conversation, I barely made eye contact with her, focusing on everyone else at the table instead. After the dinner, when it was time to leave, I hugged everyone goodbye but simply nodded at Sarah, telling her to take care. She seemed surprised by my distant farewell, standing up as I said my goodbyes. The moment passed quickly, so I don't think anyone else found it awkward. Surprisingly, my interaction with Sarah was fairly uneventful. She seemed either too intimidated or too anxious to engage in a more meaningful conversation. Whether she was overthinking it or not, I didn't dwell on it. After leaving the gathering, my son walked me out and offered for me to stay with him for a few days. I declined, assuring him that I would call. These days, I don't have a permanent residence. I spend most of my time traveling, and when I'm in town, I stay in a motel. Transitioning from being a family man for 26 years to living this nomadic lifestyle was challenging at first, but I've grown to enjoy it. There's a certain freedom in living this way, even though it's vastly different from the life I used to know. I have another update. Yes, I now have a companion. During my visit to Tokyo 2 years ago, I met Ashleen, a 52-year-old woman who had just come out of an abusive relationship. She was on her first solo trip, and we connected while hiking up a mountain. We became friends because neither of us was looking for a romantic relationship at the time. After our time in Tokyo, I headed to South Korea while she went to Thailand. We kept in touch over the next 6 months and eventually decided to plan some of our travels together. For the past year and a half, we've been traveling to more than 8 countries as companions. We didn't rush into anything physical or emotional during the first few months. We took our time getting to know each other better, and were clear from the beginning that neither of us wanted to get married. For now, we're just enjoying our travels and exploring the world together. My children knew about Ashleen, but they chose not to tell Sarah, fearing it might trigger her depression again. After arriving at the hotel, I called my son to explain why I had declined his offer to stay with him. I told him that Ashleen had come to town with me, and I didn't want to leave her alone. I also expressed my desire for Ashleen to attend the wedding. He was excited but understandably concerned about how Sarah would react. I emphasized that Ashleen was my partner now, and she deserved to meet my family. He then added my daughter to the call, so the 3 of us could discuss it. My daughter agreed with me. Ashleen should meet the family, and she didn't want her mother's feelings to overshadow the day. With the wedding a week away, I spent that time giving Ashleen a tour of the city since it was her first visit to Kentucky. On the day of the wedding, as soon as we arrived, I noticed Sarah staring at me. She was visibly upset when she saw me holding hands with Ashleen at the venue. I had warned Ashleen that Sarah might behave unpleasantly, but she assured me she could handle it. This was the first time I saw how controlling Sarah had become since our separation. She rushed over and grabbed my wrist, trying to pull me aside for a private conversation. I firmly told her I wasn't interested in talking to her alone. She then asked if Ashleen was my girlfriend, or if I planned to marry her. I replied that it wasn't her concern anymore and told her to leave us alone since guests were starting to arrive, and some were noticing her tears and anger. Sarah responded loudly, saying she didn't care about anyone else and needed to resolve things right then and there. At this point, my usually calm daughter stepped in, becoming someone I barely recognized. She didn't just lose her temper. She gave Sarah a stern talking to that I never expected. In a quiet yet forceful tone, she said, "Mom, yes, you were supposed to walk into this wedding on Dad's arm, but you chose someone else. Either accept it and move on right now, or I'll make sure you're kicked out of the wedding before it even starts." I almost wanted to step in, as any parent would when seeing their child upset, but my daughter was tougher than I could have ever been. She pointed her finger at Sarah and meant every word. The tension in Sarah's grip on my wrist loosened, and I saw her face quiver as she let go. For a few seconds, she stared at me, her expression shifting from anger to betrayal and then sadness. Without saying a word, she walked away. Needless to say, she didn't introduce herself to Ashleen. On a positive note, my daughter later apologized to Ashleen, who then hugged us both. I reassured her that there was no need to apologize. My daughter is strong, and I'm proud of her for standing up. She told me, emotionally, "Dad, we've suffered enough. She needs to move on or leave you alone." Sarah had made life miserable for everyone over the years, yet she still expected sympathy and care from her friends. My children no longer have a family home to return to for holidays or special occasions, and I acknowledge my part in that. Throughout the rest of the wedding, Sarah grew increasingly upset that our children were standing by me. She either stood alone in a corner or looked more excluded than any mother of the groom should be. She didn't even join us for the family photos. A few days later, I got a call from Emily. She mentioned that Sarah had taken the wedding as a blow to her ego. Seeing me move on so quickly while she remained single had hit her hard. I told Emily that my children and I were done with Sarah's drama. She was on her own now, free to live as she pleased, but we no longer wanted to be part of her chaos. All I want is to enjoy the rest of my life in peace. I'm considering staying closer to my kids and maybe even providing them with a family home where we can all gather comfortably. Even though they're grown now, this wedding made me realize that a new chapter of life is coming, and I might become a grandparent soon. However, I won't be sharing that stage of life with Sarah, and I'm perfectly fine with that. We'll see if Ashleen is willing to be a part of that chapter when the time comes. I just want to thank everyone for their advice and for sharing their own experiences. I encourage all of you to remain loyal and true to your spouses. If not for yourself, do it for your children. Life is good, and there's always something more to enjoy. Take care.